Hi, welcome back. This is Zodi Art. Today I am working with AB glass. These are very shiny, iridescent glass. Now, AB glass is short for glass that's treated with a thin metallic coating. It's developed by Swarovski in the mid-1950s. AB is short for Aurora Borealis crystal, named after the Northern Lights. AB glass has a sparkly, iridescent, glistening rainbow appearance. AB glass will change color when viewed from different angles. This gives a wonderful, colorful effects, even with just indoor lighting. Here are some loose AB crystals. You can see how they reflect all different colors, and they're just a lot of fun. Now I'm building off of two hoops that I've foiled. I'm going to be using 24 gauge bare copper wire, and I'm going to attach the larger of the crystals that I showed you before. Now, one thing about working with AB glass is that I would suggest making sure that you put either the coated or non-coated side up so that you're going to have them all facing the same direction, because they will look a little different. So you could tell that that was the wrong way up, because I have, obviously I'm using the coated side up. It really doesn't matter which one you do as the one side, because when you're done, it's pretty much both sides are going to be finished. But you just want to have them all go in the same direction. Now I'm using one of my boards that I made, and I have a video talking about making these boards. This is a ceiling tile board that has a nice printed array on top of it, and on top of that is clear silicone mat, so that I can work right on top of this, and I can use push pins, and then I can solder right when everything is still there. I don't have to move it somewhere else to solder. And they wash off, the silicone just washes off really nicely. So that's handy. So this is another hoop that I foiled with copper foil, and I have a whole bunch of these happy little crystals that I'm going to kind of wind around, kind of like you're sewing, to make it stay on. So here again, I'm using the same wire, and I'm just wrapping around. Well, usually what I try to do is I want to use a wire that is as thick as I can and still go through the hole and be flexible. So like, yeah, I could have used some really, really thin wire, like 28 gauge, but it wouldn't have been very strong. And sometimes you want to go through the hole 2 times when you're working on things, so that you don't want to have like really thick wire. So that's why I'm using either a 24 or 26 gauge wire for something like this, or maybe a 20 gauge, because I want it to be really flexible. And as you see, it's almost like I'm sewing with it. So I'm just wrapping around. Sometimes I use my needle nose pliers, but I'm just putting one on at a time, making sure that they all face the same direction. And then I went around the inside and kind of sewed them all together also, by going from one to another and then looping between both of them to make a nice strong connection. And then I had to separate and move the individual crystals to make sure that the array is pretty symmetrical, because sometimes they were overlapping and sometimes there was gaps, and I wanted to try to avoid that. So that would be if the non-coated side is up, and that's the coated side up, and that's the side that I'm using right now. I'm going to be adding swirls and beads to fill in the gaps between the two hoops. Now, my whole finished look on this project is going to be like kind of a cast iron look. So I know I'm going to add solder on top of all of these swirls. You don't have to do that because I'm actually going to be using a copper patina when I'm done, which would have kind of blended in with this copper wire. But I want that look of having the swirls to not be perfectly smooth. I want to have the globs between some of the swirls like you get in a like iron gate or something, so that it's not like a perfect swirl. They have the little globs of solder, and you'll see that later on. I'm using different tools to make different coils for the designs for in between. And these are going to attach the two hoops to each other eventually once I get a bunch of coils and some beads in there and some extra wires and a bunch of solder, and that'll hold it all together. Usually I make a whole bunch of these little wiggly swirly things, and then I figure out where they're going to go. Because you never know exactly what you're going to want. And I also did that with the beads. I made a whole bunch of little swirly connections with the beads and the thinner wires to put in between to figure out who goes where. So the reason I'm using the 14 gauge wire for this is I want the visualness of the thicker wire, and it goes nicely with the hoops that are actually, they're a little bit thicker than the 14 gauge wire I'm using right now, but they all end up going together very nicely. Make sure that you buy bare copper or bare brass wire for doing something like this, because you really want your solder to stick to it very easily. And those two metals are very easy to use. So after adding copper coils, I'm going to take some 18 gauge wire and I'm going to pre-bend it to go around each of the larger crystals. Now this will help support the crystals. The crystals were already foiled, so I already used a piece of foil going around each of the crystals before I attached them. But now I want to put a piece of wire around the outside of each crystal to help support the crystal. I'm using a crystal that I'm not using as a kind of a pattern to get my bend correct. And I measured how much I need for each one, so they're all going to be similar in size. And I'm bending them around this extra crystal. Yeah, this crystal's not foiled, so I'm not going to I'm not going to be, wearing off the foil. But I'm getting that to look like that shape, and then I'm going to put it in place and wire it on. And yeah, I'm using the thinner wire because I'm going to be going quite close, and I want it to get really, really tight right there. And it's just easier to maneuver a thinner piece of wire than a thicker one. So I'm using my needle nose pliers, sort of like a sewing needle, and wrapping around the 18 gauge support wire. So I'm going to put one of these around every one of the crystals, and then kind of straighten up all my crystals along the lines of that array that I made. And I'm attaching these using 28 gauge bare copper wire, It's, as I said, it's strong, but it's easy to bend. And when you get your wire, you might want to write on your spool of wire if the paper starts coming off, because it's really nice to know what wire is which when you have a whole bunch of different gauges, and then you can just grab what you need. And as you can see, I'm pre-bending it again to go around the crystal that I have in my hand. And I had to move that push pin so I could get my support wire in place. Now I often will, if I start a wire in one spot, I will just kind of loop it over to the next piece I'm doing, like I did right then, instead of starting a new piece of thin wire for each one. Now remember I said I wanted this kind of a cast iron fence type metal look, so I don't mind if it's a little bit uneven, because I want kind of an uneven gloppy solder look when it's done. So it's okay that it's not perfectly smooth. I'm using a gel flux, and I'm coating all the copper, and then I'm going to add solder to everything. So here it's ready to solder, and I'm just going to coat everything with some of this gel flux. I like using this gel flux because it's not really liquid and watery, so it kind of stays where I want to put it, but it's not a paste that I almost have to like carve on. It kind of paints on nicely. And if it gets a little thick, I can add liquid solder if I want to make it a little bit thinner, but usually I go with straight gel flux. Now you can use scraps of solder that you have, or you can use a brand new piece like I'm using right here. That yellow thing in the corner, in the upper right hand corner there, is my exhaust fan sucking my exhaust away from me. Because yeah, it's going to take a lot of solder and quite a lot of time. I think this took a couple hours to get all the soldering done on both sides and finishing up with the patina and everything. It took some time, yes. I'm going to put a crystal in the middle, right there in the middle at some point, but I'm just tinning that to get ready for the glass crystal. And I am going to turn this over when I'm done and solder all the other sides, and I'm going to look sideways at it and everything to get all the sides and everything. These circles that you see in between each of the larger crystals are going to have their own crystals. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but all those beads that I have added to the thinner, like that bead I just touched, to the thinner wires, those are all AB beads. So they all have that coating on them. So they'll all go very nicely together. And yeah, I'm moving the smaller wires here and there to make sure everything is as supportive as possible. So, and you can see how I'm leaving kind of globs of solder in places to give that look that I'm after. It's kind of fun when it leaves a big glob like that. I think that's fun. Now I'm going to add some round AB crystals, and I'm going to support them with silicone washers prior to soldering so that they are at the same levelness before I solder them, because they're usually pointed, or at least they do kind of are convex on both sides. So you want to use something to hold them in the air so that they're level to your wire before you solder them. So as you can see, this particular crystals fit the little circles I made, because I took that into account when I made those circles, because I had a whole bunch of these AB crystals ready and waiting. Here again, make sure that they are the correct side up. I'm putting the coated side toward me. And even with these little circles, I want to make sure that everything goes the same direction. After I've gone over everything, I am now turning my project over and coating the back with flux, and then going over all the copper that I can see with solder. Now, there's going to be globs of solder that came up when I did the other side. So a lot of the time I don't have to add more solder. I can just kind of spread out the solder that's already there. But then at other times I will have to add some more. There will be times when, because I'm heating up the wires, that the whole wire will get really hot and maybe a piece will fall off. And then I'll just have to solder it back on. Supporting those little round crystals again. This time I had to put 2 washers underneath. At times is probably a good idea, because heating up that very small crystal will probably make it so hot that it might just fall right out of that circle. See that little piece of wire with, and there may be a bead attached to that, fell off. So I have to solder it back on because I want it still. It was a little swirly guy. And solder comes in usually a large spool. So I usually like to chop off but like a foot long piece to work with. I don't like working off the spool. I like to have a free piece of solder in my hand. And then when they get really short, I just use pliers or tweezers to hold the little scrap. Because, yeah, I don't waste any solder. I will use every little bit. Especially since my projects use a lot of solder. I mean, if you're going to take something like this and coat all this wire with solder, it's gonna take a bunch of solder. Sometimes you want to skip around and not just work in one area, because that will help prevent your area from getting too hot and making your crystals and wires fall off. For the beads, I sometimes will, if possible, move the bead a little bit along the wire so I can get solder underneath the bead, inside where it's strung together. So I will also pick up the project and try to get all the edges and sides of everything. Make sure that there's no bare copper showing. Now, because I'm going to use a copper patina on this particular project, if I have little spots of copper that I didn't quite cover, it's probably not going to show because it's all going to be copper colored. Also at this time, if I have large globs coming from the other side or whatever when I was working, this is the time to knock those big globs off, because we don't, we might not want all the globs. So yeah, I'm just sucking up little pieces that fell off the project and using them to fill other areas. If you haven't washed your project yet, you probably have enough flux on it from doing both sides to not have to add flux at this moment. So after I've succeeded in covering all the copper with solder and getting rid of any extra globs that I don't like, I wash my project. I use soap, usually like Dawn dishwashing soap, and one of my subscribers suggested using vinegar, and I've heard about it from other people, and so I washed it in vinegar, and I'm applying Novocaine copper patina, and I use a spray bottle because it makes a very light mist, which is very nice. Now, if you're going to scrub it or use Q-tips, make sure you wear gloves because you don't want to actually touch patina. It's really not good for you. This copper patina is fun. It gives kind of an uneven, coppery look, which is exactly what I wanted. See, you can see how it would look very different if I didn't put solder globs all over the place. And so I'm spraying lightly, and then I'm using a gloved hand and turning it over and doing the other side. Now I like to brush on some cutting oil that I use for my regular machines and my cutters. And I like to brush that on the patina. It seems to work for me to give it a nice shine, and then I rub it off. This is my finished project, and it's very shiny and iridescent, and I just think it's so much fun to work with AB glass. And I hope you give it a try. And thanks for watching, and as always, please subscribe. Thank you.